In this video, we'll be learning how to use the Studio One compressor, and whether you're a complete beginner or an old hand, there's something in it for you. Hi folks, I'm Mike and I hope you're well. Now, I own many compressor plugins, but I do find that I keep coming back to the stock compressor plugin which comes with Studio One. There's something about its interface, its ease of use. I just find I can get my compression jobs done really quickly and easily. So in today's video, I'm going to be running through how to use that particular plugin. But don't worry if you've never done any compression before, or you've tried and you found it confusing, because I will be explaining the basics of compression as we go along. Now, if you're a more experienced user, I'm going to be teaching you about the specifics of this plugin and how you get things done, as well as talking about some slightly more advanced topics like parallel compression and sidechain compression. So please do stick around for all of that. Now, if this is your first time here and you do like this kind of content, then please do make sure you subscribe and ring the bell on YouTube so that you are notified about my future videos. Now, let's get into some compression. So a compressor is basically an automated volume control, and it can make changes to the volume really quickly and efficiently, much quicker than we as human beings could by controlling a fader in our DAW. Now, as I say, it's automated, so it's going to make those changes based upon the parameters that we give it. And that's what all of these controls are on the screen that you can see here. Now, it may surprise you to hear that I think of compressors' main function as reducing volume. That's what most of these controls are going to work towards. And that may be contrary to what you believe, because you've probably heard of compressors in terms of making kick drums punchier or making vocals cut through a mix, making them sound louder. We can get to that eventually, but as I say, the primary focus of the compressor is to actually reduce volume. Okay, so let's start off with that first, because if we're going to tell this compressor to reduce volume, it's going to need to know when to reduce that volume. At what point does it decide, hey, things are getting too loud, let's turn them down? Well, the main control for that is the one that you can see on the left and in the middle here, and that's the threshold control. In fact, it's the only control for it. This is the point at which we say, hey, that signal is going to need to be reduced. Now, if we listen to the signal I've got queued up at the moment, it's a bass guitar, you'll be able to see in the middle here in this display what's happening with that signal. So on the left and right, you can see those level meters there. That obviously shows you the current level of the signal. And if I play it again, just look out for the sort of white dots or lines that you can see there as well. That's the RMS, or the average level of the signal. Now I'll play it again and then have a look at the top. Look at this bar here. You can just see a little bit of change there. That is the amount at which the compressor is currently reducing the signal. You can see it was doing it by a peak of -1 dB there, so just a little bit of volume change, turning it down. But it started to turn it down after it's reached this threshold of -15 dB. Now, as I say, you can control it here, you can lower it down. You can also control it by dragging this dot around here. Okay, that represents the threshold. So if I bring it down really, really low and then play it again, what's going to happen is a lot more of that signal is going to be reduced in volume. So you're going to see much more happening at the top here. So this is going to be a really important part of your decision-making process when you're using a compressor. How much of that signal do I want to chop the top off of? And you'll use the threshold to do that. So we use the threshold control to tell the compressor at which point to start lowering the volume. Now we need to tell it how much to lower that volume by. And for that, we're going to use the ratio control. Now, lots of people get really confused at this point with ratio, so I'm going to try and keep this as simple as I can. Look at the two numbers that we can see here, which are separated by a colon. They're 2.0 and they're 1. Or 2 and 1. Now, in ratio terms, we refer to that as a 2-to-1 ratio. Now, all you really need to focus on is the first of those numbers. Now, the lower this number is, the less we will be reducing the volume by once we reach the threshold. The higher that number is, the more we will be reducing the volume by once we reach the threshold. So I'm going to take a look at it in its extremes. I'm going to use the control and just reduce this all the way down to its lowest value, which is 1 to 1. Okay, now I could have done that over here in the display, by the way, just by dragging the end of that line around. That enables me to change the ratio there as well. Now at this point, at that lowest value, actually what we're saying is once we go over the threshold, don't reduce the volume at all. In other words, we're not doing any compression. We're not actually doing anything. And if I play this bass guitar, you'll see that this will not have anything displayed here, this top part. So even though we're going over the threshold there, nothing's actually happening, okay? Next to useless. Now, if we put it to the other extreme, all the way down, we're going to turn this to a 20 to 1 ratio, and you'll see the way that line changed there. That means we're going to reduce that volume by the maximum amount that we can with this compressor, which is 20 to 1. That's a lot of compression. So once it goes over the threshold, we're going to reduce that volume by an awful lot. And you'll see now if I play that bass guitar that there's a lot of volume reduction happening here. Now, at this point, it's close to what you call limiting. It's hardly letting any of that signal above the threshold through. It's just clamping down on it and keeping it at roughly the volume where we set the threshold. Okay, so that's a really very extreme compression there. Often we're using settings anything from about 2 to 1 through to 4 to 1, maybe 8 to 1, that kind of thing. All right. It depends on the instrument that we're compressing and the effect that we want to get. More on that a little bit later. But that's basically what the ratio control is for. We're saying how much are we going to reduce this volume by. So far, all of the rules we've given the compressor are to do with level. We use the threshold control to determine at which level we'll start to reduce the volume, and we use the ratio control to determine how much we'll reduce that volume by. Now, the next two controls we're going to look at are to do with timing, and those are the attack and release controls. So let's start off with attack. At the moment, you can see it's set to 15 milliseconds. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is once our signal reaches that threshold of minus 21 decibels, we will wait 15 milliseconds before we implement that rule set by the ratio. Okay, let's go over it again. So our signal reaches minus 21 as it's set here by the threshold. It waits 15 milliseconds and then it starts to reduce the volume based on the levels or the values set in the ratio. So if we put this attack time all the way down to next to nothing, 0.1 milliseconds. That means as soon as we reach that threshold, it will start to implement that ratio rule there. If we go to the other extreme on this compressor, it's 400 milliseconds. Okay, it's quite a long time. So it's sort of sluggish. It's going to hit that threshold, but it's going to let an awful lot of that signal through. It's not going to change it in any way whatsoever. It's going to wait 400 milliseconds, and then it will start to reduce that volume by whatever value we've determined with the ratio. Okay, now there's a lot more to it in practical terms, but we'll get to that in a moment. Let's first of all look at the release value here. So the release value is set to 120 milliseconds. This is happening at the other end of the signal. So what we're saying here is once we fall below the threshold that we had set here, let's wait 120 milliseconds before we stop implementing this rule set by the compressor, before we stop compressing, in other words. Okay, so at some point the signal will fall again below that threshold, which is set here, and we're going to wait. We're going to keep implementing that rule, and then after 120 milliseconds we're going to set everything back to normal. And this is really, really important because sometimes the compressor can kick in, and if that's too long, it'll start to compress the next sort of thing or event which is happening in that audio. I'll explain it a little bit better than that in just a moment. Now, there's different ways you can learn about these controls, and it does take time to learn how to use them. These are the sort of thing that you can't really take a shortcut to. You need to use this, put it into practice, and you'll gradually learn how to use these controls really, really quickly. But a couple of ways that you can learn about them a little bit more quickly. One, I think, and I say this sort of cautiously, is to use some of the presets. I wouldn't really recommend using the presets off the bat, but if you just want to start to learn about, hey, what are some common settings in terms of attack and release for different things, you could start with presets. And there's some presets on this Studio One compressor. So we'll go at the top there. I've got the drums folder open there, but you can see there's presets for guitar, all sorts of different instruments there, vocals, etc. So you could go in and pull up, say, you know, the preset for the female vocal, and that will give you some idea of a ballpark figure. Now, it won't give you any idea in terms of threshold. Although it will set it, you definitely have to set your threshold according to the signal that you're receiving, okay? And it may help you quite a lot, I guess, with ratio, and it's going to probably help you get going with those attack and release times. But you still want to use your ears and adjust those things according to your needs, because every signal is a little bit different, okay? Now, the other way, and this is probably my preferable way to start learning about this, is to start to look at some of your waveforms. So I'll pull one up now. And what we're looking at here is, in fact, a kick drum, okay? Or as they say in the UK, a bass drum. Okay, let's just have a listen to that. Now you can see here that it's got particular characteristics. You can see that initially it goes up to a fairly high volume and then very quickly drops down, okay? We call that the transient, okay? And in the case of a kick drum here, you can see that it happens very quickly and the whole thing's gone. So you would be thinking about your attack quite a lot here, yeah? You would be thinking about, look, if I want to actually compress this part here, I need to get that attack fairly low in order to catch it in time and start reducing it. Now, you then might want to think about the distance between these two signals. If that held on for too long, if I had that release value very, very long, then it's still going to be compressing when it reaches the next kick drum there, and I might not want that to happen. Let's look at another signal here. Let's look at this one, which is the bass guitar, which we were dealing with earlier, okay? Now, this has a very, very different waveform, doesn't it? The transient at the beginning is not nearly as sort of spiky as that kick drum was there. It's obviously much longer as well, and the gap between the two notes here is pretty short. So I would want to make sure, if I don't want to compress the beginning of this part here, this bass sound here, I want to make sure that that compressor isn't hanging on and compressing the beginning of it as a result of reacting to the signal back here. I hope that made sense, okay? So it's really helpful to sort of, if you can't decide how you want to set these attack and release times, then first of all think, what do I want to do to the signal? Do I want to let that transient through? Do I want to let it come through so we've got a little bit of punch at the beginning, or do I want to squash everything? And then start to, you know, look at those waveforms, look at the timings of them and say, look, how many milliseconds is it there before, you know, certain things happen in that waveform, okay? And just as a by the way, if I go back to this view, you'll see that it's handy if you do this to right click on the ruler there and set the time base to seconds, and then you can calculate from there. I think each one of these lines, or the gaps between the lines here in this case, is representing 50 milliseconds, okay? So that will help me to determine what gap is between my notes there. So I'll definitely want to make sure, if I don't want to kill the beginning of this bass note, that I'm releasing before I get there, okay? So those are the sort of considerations you have in terms of attack and release. So the next control I'd like to take a look at is the knee control. It's in the bottom left here. Now, there's a couple of ways you can control this. You can use the knob here, obviously, to change the values up and down like so. Or you can go to the dot in the middle where the threshold is indicated, and you can use your the scroll wheel on your mouse to adjust the knee there, okay? So what does the knee do? Well, let's put it all the way down to its lowest value. Now you can see what would happen here is the signal will reach the threshold and it's affected by our ratio value, yeah? And it's affected fully at this point, okay, by 4:1 ratio. Now what happens with the knee is we can soften the effect. So as we implement the knee a little bit, once it reaches the threshold, it does adjust the signal, but not by the full amount which is set by the ratio. It gradually starts to apply the ratio at smaller values, working its way up to the value that we've set. So all the way up here on this line, it's already being affected at a ratio of 4:1. But down here near the threshold, it's a little bit less. In fact, with the knee, the threshold starts to kick in a little bit below where we've set it there, okay? So the knee starts here, it starts to implement a little bit of volume reduction here, then gradually increases it as it goes up to its full amount up here, okay? So obviously, the softer the knee, if we put that all the way up, the effect of the ratio starts kicking in earlier and is gradually added at a more gradual rate as we go further up above the threshold. Now, this is a way of just making your compressor a little bit more transparent. Sometimes when you've got a compressor set, and if it's got a hard knee, it becomes sort of fairly obvious at which point the compressor is kicking in, and you don't always want to do that. So if you want to make it a little bit more transparent about where the threshold is making the compressor kick in, then use the knee control for that. So as I said earlier, it seems most often compressors are associated with making things sound louder. You'll hear about people applying them to kick drums to make them punchier, or they use them on vocals to keep them on top of the mix. And yet everything we've done so far reduces the volume, right? Well, yeah, that's true, but remember, it's only reducing the volume of the signal after it goes over the threshold. So we can use it to start to reduce the peaks so that they don't go up so high. Now, if we didn't use compression to reduce those peaks, then as we start to turn the volume of the track up, it won't be long before those peaks start going over 0 dB. They start to clip, and digital distortion sounds absolutely awful. It's the thing you don't want. So by taking the top off of the signal, by cutting off those peaks, we've given ourselves headroom. Now we can push the whole volume of the track up, and it will be longer before it starts to peak or clip. Okay. Now we do that here with the Studio One compressor by using the gain control. I can adjust it here, and you can see visually how we can push the whole signal of the track up. It's going to start to sound louder, but because we've controlled the peaks, they're not going to go over 0 dB. Now you can either do it manually like this, or there is an automatic control where Studio One tries to determine automatically for you how much you can increase that volume before it starts to peak. I think the auto feature is pretty good, but I have to say, for me personally, I like to use the manual feature and get it just right for myself. So everything we've looked at so far are really the basics of compression. I'm just going to talk about a couple of more slightly advanced things which are actually quite easy to implement here in Studio One. The first thing I want to talk about is parallel compression. So parallel compression is quite simple. You take your first signal, say like a vocal, you send it off to a bus or an auxiliary, and then you add loads of compression, really heavy compression, squash that signal. It would sound awful. But when you blend the original signal on the original track with the bus, then you can get a really nice form of quite natural sounding compression, and it can help keep things like, say, vocals on top of a mix, as we were talking about earlier. So you can actually implement parallel compression really, really easily here without creating a bus of any kind, and that's simply by using the mix control. Now, normally, if you've got the compressor on a track and you're using it in normal ways, which we were earlier, then you'll just have this mix on full, okay? And you might be doing just a little bit of compression. But as I say, with parallel compression, we want to add loads and loads of compression, really extreme. You know, we might put the ratio up very high and then the threshold really low and have the attack really, really short, and it's going to sound awful. But if we put this all the way down to 0 and then we start to blend the compression mixed in, then we can use that as parallel compression without having to go through the hassle of creating an extra bus. So the other type of compression that we hear discussed a lot is sidechain compression. And here in the Studio One plugin, it's really quite easy to implement it. There's two types which we're going to discuss. There's internal sidechain compression and external sidechain compression. We'll start off with internal, and to be honest, it's much easier demonstrated than it is explained. So we're just going to start off by switching it on. We'll go to this bottom right-hand corner and we'll just click on this filter button here, okay? Now when we turn that on, you can see that these two controls become available. One is a low cut filter where we control the frequency here, and a high cut, which is where we control the frequency there. Now there are frequencies in between, and those frequencies are the frequencies which are actually going to affect the compression. So this is a way of filtering before we start to compress, well, filtering the signal before we start to use it for compression. So it doesn't change the sound of the actual instrument. It means we're only going to select certain frequencies within that sound to actually adjust the compression. So let's try it out here. You probably still don't understand. Okay, what I'm going to do is select a frequency range by pushing this low cut up, and we'll go like this. And what I'm going to do is play this bass guitar again, but I'm going to click this listen filter. This is going to listen to the frequencies there, okay? The frequencies which are being determined by these controls. So what I'm trying to look for personally here are those kind of higher end things, perhaps where I tap on the strings with the bass guitar, that kind of thing. Yeah, just those sort of little clicks, and I'm trying to narrow that down. Now, I'd probably spend a lot more time on this normally, but what I'm saying is it's only these frequencies which I will use to determine how much I'm going to compress. So I'll turn that off, and now you'll see that's switched off, that because only that part of the signal is being used to determine the compression, we're not getting as much compression at all. So there's nothing happening there at all, okay? There's no compression. And that's because if we listen to that signal again, it's actually really, really quiet as well, isn't it? Okay, so in order for those frequencies to start to affect our compression at all, we would have to lower that threshold. So let's see what happens if we do that. Now, if we didn't have that switched on, that filter at all, then look what happens to the signal now. So I haven't set that up in the best possible way, but you could use this in effect as something like a de-esser. So you could select certain frequencies, and that would be a good example, those sort of sibilant sounds, and you could say, hey, look, I only want to take those frequencies and use those frequencies to start to reduce the signal. So lastly, we're going to discuss how to implement external sidechain compression here with the Studio One compressor. And I'm glad to say it's really quite easy to implement. But first of all, let's have a chat about what external sidechain compression is. So up until now, we've been compressing this bass guitar using the signal of this bass guitar to determine how much we will compress by. Yeah, makes sense. Well, with sidechain compression, we can use the signal from another instrument to determine how much we're going to reduce the signal of the bass guitar by. Now, the most stereotypical advantage of this, which I'm going to do now, is we're going to use the kick drum to compress the signal from the bass guitar. What that means is that usually if we didn't compress it, the bass and the kick are kind of competing with each other, and the bass doesn't give that kick drum much room to come through and really be heard. So what we're doing is we're saying, hey, look, when that kick drum hits, if it's hitting at the same time that bass guitar is playing, we're going to temporarily reduce the volume of that bass guitar so that we can hear that kick drum, yeah? So it's a very, very useful technique. Another example might be for, say, voiceovers in a video where we've got a music backing track, but once the person starts talking, once that comes in, we want to make sure we automatically reduce the volume of the music in the background. And that's another way that we could use sidechain compression. So how do we implement it in Studio One? Well, it's really, really quite easy. We go up to this button at the top and we click sidechain, okay? And that's switched on our external sidechain compression. So these controls are no longer available to us. We can't do any of this stuff down here, and it says external sidechain. Then we just need to simply select the track or the channel that has the instrument on it which we want to use to compress our bass guitar. So we'll just go to this little menu here. We can see a list of other tracks on the project, and I'm going to select kick here, which is my main channel for my kick drum. So now what happens when I play the bass guitar, and I'll switch the kick drum on for you so you can hear it. When I play the bass guitar, you'll see that the kick drum is affecting the signal of the bass guitar. Okay, now if you find that that kick drum is just not loud enough to be affecting it as much as you want it to, you can use this control here, the side gain control, okay? You notice I'm not actually making the kick drum sound louder by doing that. I'm just allowing more of its signal through to the calculations for when this compressor is adjusting the volume of the bass guitar, okay? You can still go ahead and change your ratio, your threshold, your attack and release, all that good stuff. But that is how you use sidechain compression in this Studio One compressor. So I do hope that you found this video useful. If you've got any questions whatsoever, please do ask in the comments down below, and myself or somebody else from this wonderful community will try their very best to help you out. Talking about wonderful communities, do check out the link in the description down below for the Creative Source forums. There's a growing group of people there from all over the world who are helping each other out with all things to do with home recording, so definitely check that one out. Now if you did like this video, make sure you hit the like button. That tells YouTube that it should show this video to other people. If you didn't like this video at all, do hit the dislike button twice. And if you like this kind of content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and ring the bell on YouTube so that you're notified about my future videos. Now if you've been watching my other videos and you're interested in the gear that I use in my studio, then make sure you check out the link to my gear guide down in the description, and I have a list there of previous items that I've used in my studio and the current items as well. Now with all of that said, thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.